Everybody, people register, and they find out.
I know how they feel.
Yeah, I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure. One thing I want to know is, what
Well,
about
there's some theory. I mean, my wrist thing that's going on might be the result of 15 years of bicycle riding.
they're okay then?
Yeah, just look that out.
The toys. Yeah, all you really want to.
I mean, they must get like
Over
thousands.
there and
So a
Linda,
lot of times they give it back. They usually pile up, they also, sometimes they leave them in heat.
People wear no skirts.
Yeah, it's a question.
anywhere you look, there's a Linda.
Yeah, I mean, you can be so stupid with them or something. Like roll them up and put them in
They're
little.
not really that.
Oh, yeah.
In the old days.
Not everybody, not universally, but
Everything.
I mean, I've been like,
Like now, they're strong. It's sort of like leftovers. They never wear out.
Good for you.
All right, welcome back. And so now we have our opportunity for questions and answers and discussion. And just a reminder and some encouragement, especially if you're new in particular, we welcome your questions. They don't ever think that, oh, this question is too basic or obvious. If it is, there's a good chance none of us have even thought to think of it. So we need your help in identifying those things. So, yes, Rosemary.
Just a curiosity.
Yeah.
The practice that you shared with us,
Yeah.
it's great. I'm curious about what about it is special for you and how you use it in your daily practice.
So the question is about the 7-step practice and how I've been using it in my daily practice and what I like so much about it. I think yeah, I've been doing it every day, and I do it as my, I do shamatha practice, and so I do it as my shamatha practice every day. And I think it's, and this is just my own experience or hope or whatever, but I have noticed that it's been seeping into my life, particularly at times of stress or distress when I find myself bringing peace to my breathing or being aware of my body or sending peace to my body. And I think it's a practice of cultivating practice as refuge, because the objects are the things that you have that you can take refuge in. You can take refuge in your breathing. Sometimes you can't because your breathing's too chaotic, but then you can send peace to your breathing. And then it can be a refuge. Same with your body. Sometimes your body can be a refuge. Sometimes it's in distress and it needs some help. So you can send it that help. And you can take refuge in joy if you can experience it and appreciate it. Some people are really good at that. Some people are naturals. Some of us are totally terrible at it. Some of us wouldn't know joy if it walked up and kicked them in the shin. And letting go can be, death and impermanence can actually be refuges. There's no burden that's so great that you won't eventually put it down. And the truth is kind of what my teacher was pointing to, that all we really get in life are a series of moments. That's what we have. And each moment is fading, and we can grasp it or try to push it away, but whatever we do with it, it's fading. And you can resist that, or you can try. It doesn't actually work. Or you can go with the flow. So I found it just a tremendously deep and beneficial practice. It's really my favorite shamatha practice I've ever done. So I've been enjoying it a lot. That's why I keep bringing it back every week. Well, thank you for asking. Michael.
It seemed like such a natural progression that I wondered if maybe the person who wrote it down was just describing what happened during their practice.
Michael noted that it's such a natural progression. He wonders if the person who devised the practice was simply describing the practice, the progression of their practice. And I had the same wondering. Like, it seems like it's more than just a series of practices. It seems like it's a path. And I wondered the same thing. The provenance of the practice is, it probably comes from Thich Nhat Hanh. It certainly has the flavor and features of practices that he teaches, and but it came to me through the Zen teacher Norman Fisher. Yes, John.
So I was a little late this morning, and I didn't catch your entire story about the false refuges, and I might have missed something important.
Okay.
But what I did hear of the teaching is it raises sort of a common refrain for me. It's sort of the false refuge teachings, and it connects a little bit with the four thoughts that turn the mind, of not having much time, and spending your time on good stuff rather than bad stuff. So I hear about false refuges, and I often have the thought, well, I am so addicted to my false refuges that is a hopeless thing to let them go, and it makes me feel bad and gives me another opportunity to beat up on myself
Yes.
about it.
Yes.
So do you have any tips for sort of turning that thinking into something a little more positive in life?
So it's a really a beautiful question, and thank you for sharing it. And I'm going to restate it for the streaming, but I'm not going to say it nearly as well as you just did. So John raised the what must be a common experience, I certainly share it, of hearing teachings about false refuge and true refuge, or we could say bad refuge and good refuge. And having had the experience that the bad refuges are so compelling that it seems impossible to put them down, and that the outcome of trying to do so merely seems to be maybe more guilt or more shame. And he also linked it to the four thoughts that turn the mind, which I'll just say briefly are contemplations designed to help us understand why we practice. And the four thoughts are the preciousness of human existence, the precious opportunity we have that this life affords us. The second is death and impermanence. The third is the truth of karma, or cause and effect. And the fourth is the unsatisfactory nature, the suffering of samsara, of conditioned existence. I think the path that you outlined should be a familiar one. Of you think that you should be some way other than you are. I should do good things and not do bad things. I should be a good person, not a bad person. I should this, that. And periodically we feel inspired to do something about the state of affairs. Maybe we invest energy in it. And a common experience then is once our inspiration fades or our willpower runs out, then we backslide, or we go back to what we were doing before. And it's easy to see from that space how we could say, well, not only are we bad for doing those things now, we're also bad for failing to fix the situation. I mean, does anybody not find that a familiar, has anybody not had that experience?
Yesterday.
Yeah, has anybody not had that experience yet today?
Please tell us if you've never had that. We want to know. We're going to make you sit there.
Most of
Well, you should have. You should have.
this hospice nurse had a very interesting take on that situation. Her basic thesis was that the obstacle that, or the what keeps us stuck are ungrieved losses and guilt and shame. And she said that the experience that we're avoiding when we go through that cycle, we're basically choosing shame over a much scarier truth, which is that we are helpless in the face of our conditioning. If we tried and we couldn't do it, then the reality was we were helpless. If we weren't helpless, we would have prevailed. And she says it's coming to terms with that helplessness, with that feeling of helplessness, and not running away from it or cloaking it in shame is the way out. You know, my own teacher, and I've been coming to him with the exact scenario that you laid out in probably 1,000 different permutations now for the past 10 or 12 years. Every week I manage to concoct a new version of that story, and I'm like, what about that? You know, surely I can fix that, right? I could do that better, right? And every week it's the same answer, which is he doesn't even want to engage me in the question. And I guess the core of it is the pathway to peace doesn't entail more struggling. So it's not a doing. There's nothing you can do, per se. It's more of a not doing. And how does that happen? Well, this hospice nurse says that it's through forgiveness and grieving. There are probably other ways to do it. That, you know, as a hospice nurse, those would be the two that she would be, you know, she would probably be best at. There's probably other ways to do it too. Those are two pretty good ones. I guess the main thing I would offer, John, is and I'm offering this to myself and to all of us, is encouragement. So I think you need a tremendous amount of support and encouragement. To face the things about yourself and about your experience that you don't want to see, that you loathe or fear or hate. It's like she said, it requires a lot of courage. And therefore it requires a lot of encouragement. It requires honesty, which we're very good at. It requires humility because, as one of my social worker friends told me, the path to humility entails humiliation. And it requires a lot of compassion and patience and kindness. And if you can get enough of that, then maybe you have the courage to actually look at the experience that's driving you towards your false refuge, towards your addiction. Maybe you have the courage to be there with it and see it for what it is, which is just an experience. It's actually not harmful at all. But it doesn't do any good to think that or for me to say it. You have to spend enough time with it in the right state of mind to see it for what it is. Talked longer than I meant to on that one. Yes.
I just kind of wanted to add to that, like, there was a time when I was a lot younger and I was an apprentice sushi chef, and while I was training, my sensei, and he had a friend of his who had been this big fancy chef, used to have a restaurant on the top of a mountain where people were helicoptered in, so a really big shot chef. And when I was training, they asked me, have you ever cut yourself? And at the time, I was kind of young. I'd been a prep cook before this, and I tried to be like, oh, well, I try not to very much, you know, and I was kind of trying to be all, like, be impressive, and they just laughed at me. They were just like, and my sensei looked at his friend and was like, have you ever cut yourself? He's like, oh, yeah. And, like, a few weeks later, I was working with a knife, and I cut myself really deep into the bone.
Oh.
And my sensei just told me to get a Band-Aid and wrap it up, and at the time I was kind of like a little freaked out by that. You know, and about that time I had a friend of mine who was also a motorcycle rider, and he had done it for many years, and I asked him, he'd been in a wreck once, and I asked him, well, isn't that scary? Doesn't that deter you from riding your bike? And he said, no, I mean, if you get a wreck and you get back on your bike, you become a much better rider. And that's actually sort of considered to be like a required part of riding a motorcycle, is that you're not really a good rider until you've had a wreck and gotten back on it. And I've found that to be true with most things in life. I mean, I've ridden a longboard, I've gotten in bad wrecks, gotten back on them, I got better. I mean, horseback riders talk about getting back on a horse. And I think for me it's helpful to remember that failure isn't a separation of the process of getting good at something in training. It's not like this separate process where you're doing badly if you fail. It's a required part of the process. You're supposed to fail over and over and over again, because if you don't get good. Every time you fail, you're exploring some new aspect or some new technique or some new way of doing it. So feeling guilty about it, you don't need to, because it's like you're not failing, you're succeeding if you fail. It's just another, you're like, oh, okay, well, that didn't work. Let me tweak this a little bit this time, and I'll try that again. And for me, I find it's helpful just to remember that and be like, well, the main thing is to just keep at it, because if I'm failing, then I'm learning. It's not really a failure in that sense. It's, in a bigger picture, it's actually a success. Because it means you're actually trying. I mean, you could not be trying. Yeah.
I want to share something about how I'm working with it. which I hope is helpful. So I started seeing, of course, we see the addiction pattern. Then I started seeing the next level, like beat myself up, try, fail, beat myself up. So right now, I'm just working on, you get to do that. You get to do it. And I think what I'm doing is holding it. I realized as Erik was talking, I'm holding it with more compassion. Like, okay, you get to eat your whole bag of chips or your, whatever it is. And it's like, I'm doing this. Okay, I see you're doing it. That's okay. Instead of the, wow, this is bad. Because I realized I wasn't even enjoying it anymore because I'm being mean to myself while I do it. But what it has done is kind of open up some space. And I think with what Erik was sharing, in that space, there's more room to go, what is this? What is this? And get to that, what's driving it. So it's the seeing it. So I decided at least, pull off at least that top thing, which is a suffering on top of pain, and just say, I'm not going to judge myself. I'm going to say, I see, I'm doing this. I'm going to look at, well, how's that going for you? And I found that the behaviors are not so potent anymore. They're kind of loosening. It's like, okay, I get to do it all I want. Not so interesting. So if that's helpful, it's like a step toward it.
Yeah. I love I think the seeing part is so important, and seeing how it does work out or not. And I noticed, you start to notice things like the idea of having pie is 80% of the time for me, it's like, it's more interesting than the pie when if I pay attention. There's a bunch of them I don't even like. Or I go to a restaurant that's just made of the worst, but it looked good. And what was it I was wanting? And did I acknowledge that actually I didn't get that thing that I was wanting? Or did I just start looking at the cookies now? Maybe that will work out, or maybe this other thing. And so I find myself, I'm seeking something, and I don't always bother to look and notice that I didn't even get that from that thing. And then maybe I got some other, whatever. Then you got bad health, you got discomfort, you got all these things. So just paying attention to what actually happens. And then if I can at times inject, maybe I don't want to do my meditation now, but if I do, then pay attention to that too. How did I feel having done that? Do I actually, maybe that made me feel a little better, and maybe that's worth, reinforcing. So there's just paying more attention. I think in some ways that kind of renunciation is something that actually can happen more than we force it on ourselves. It can just happen, and that's the I feel like that's the best way. Is it comes naturally because that's actually what we want now. Is we want different things. It is slow training.
I'll add something. Kind of is one way to summarize what Sarah said. There's somebody that's quoted as saying that the original quote of it's usually said that if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. That the original quote was actually, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Because you will have to struggle and fall off the bike or the horse or whatever that equivalent is. So that is actually embedded in it. And that's a great pith instruction, that you really have to deal with that. There's something that's embedded in the way I think a lot of us think about this, which is there's kind of an embedded assumptions slightly there, maybe sometimes more than others, that we need to be able to overcome this kind of this addictiveness before we get on to doing the real thing. And that is like, no, this is a completely hopeless approach. It is 100% hopeless. That's like not shooting yourself in both feet before you start the race. It's not just good enough to shoot yourself in one, but you have to shoot both in both feet, because it's just not going to work to hold that approach. You have to be kind of strategic about maybe I'll get a little bit better about stepping away from some of the things that are the most pernicious impacts on myself and others. But the notion that we would actually just step away from the addictiveness, that the compulsiveness, that one is embedded so deep that if we don't get to the bottom of that until Buddhahood. So expecting otherwise is just a way to sort of magnify the sense of impossibility, or it just creates a complete sense of impossibility. The instructions to look into the experiences themselves, particularly thinking less about the kind of the particulars of whether it's chips or potato or ice cream or this or that, whatever the particulars are, but looking more at actually that sense of compulsiveness, that sense of being kind of lost and projected, and being able to actually kind of really look into that, settle into that experience and see it for what it is. It does have that impact that you described of being, it's not what it was before.
Yeah.
But you actually have to look at that as opposed to go back to check in with the old referee that's going to keep score on whether or not you're doing it right or wrong.
Yeah.
That referee has to be fired.
Gently.
Or firmly.
Thanks for sharing. Addictions don't go down.
Yeah.
Stop working.
Go ahead, Linda.
So I really don't know if I'll be able to say what's niggling under here, but we're in that. So I didn't find Buddhism until after several decades of psychotherapy and various avenues in that regard. And when your hospice nurse friends are talking about shame and guilt and unhealed wounds and wounds that we're not aware of because we have them covered up by whatever compulsive things we're covering them up with. I spent a very long time trying to figure out what those things were, and without what I found in Buddhism, that was very helpful to a point, and then what I actually was learning to do beyond that was just kind of dig the groove of those things ever deeper. So the line in the Mahamudra aspiration pair about these things will dissolve on their own, it's really important to me because the difference from coming here and learning actual mind training, I'm looking at Tim, Buddhist things to do once you're in the muck, having that to turn to is the crucial difference for me. And when you said about taking true refuge, to finish a piece of whatever digging around to try and find what the deep wounds are, it's so different to be able to turn to a true refuge at the end of that work and practice there for a while. Like I have to remember, at the bottom of that painful thing, whatever it might be at that time, to just sit, even though I might not completely understand where I am yet, or completely have cleared out the old energy or pain or whatever it is, to just sit there for a while and take refuge again, and then trust over time that the problem will dissolve on its own if I do that too. And I think that's a really big difference about being here with all of this support than trying to do it without that. Just want to say that.
That's lovely. Let's see, why don't we have, we'll give Diane the last word.
I just wanted to say that as far as I'm concerned, everybody in this room is fine just the way you are right now today. And I really mean that. I really mean that. And I don't understand why we in the West have this sense of being personally deficient. You know, we all do things that aren't smart, Lydia, and stuff like that. You know, but we're fine. And, you know, I spent about a year in the East, and they don't think like that. They don't think like that. And for all the things that they don't have, the money and the cars and the opportunities and everything, they're a whole lot happier than we are. And I just, you know, I just think we should be really grateful that we have the Dharma. And we're able to see this. And we're able to work with this, and you know, that we can acknowledge that we do this and really take a good look at that and say, do I really need to have this burden on me? Because as far as I'm concerned, we don't. I mean, we're all really pretty good people. You know? We really are.
All right. And on that note, let's quit while we're Let's dedicate the merit.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
And since we will be having the OMSE, nominally the OMSE meeting here in about 15 minutes, I want to extend an invitation to anybody who's perhaps interested in this kind of service. We say OMSE referring to the chant leader, but there are a variety, there's a basket of things to do that are not necessarily just the chant leading, including taking care of the meditation space and the altar, and also taking care of the hospitality and the tea. And these things in the future will separate out more naturally in our new space. So if people have interest in opening their practice to include any of these things, please feel free to stay. And I'll be offering a few comments about the general, kind of a general perspective on this service to start out with. So
How long is the meeting going to be?
I think until noon is what the email said. Till noon.
Yeah, till noon.
About 45 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you.